Kerri Keffeler, and welcome to my daisy bead tutorial. For today's tutorial, I am using a handheld graphite marver, a straight edge razor tool, a bent steel rake, effitre black, ochre yellow, and white, as well as the medium duo press from Zuzi. I'm starting off with a 3/32-inch mandrel for this demonstration, although you're certainly welcome to use a 1/16. This press that I'll be using works well for either size. I'm going to be building the base in black. Again, you're welcome to substitute another color if you prefer. I just thought black would be a little easier for you to see the contrast of the white flower petals against it. I always start off by creating a fairly large gather for my mandrel. Now, this is not a very large press. If you don't have this exact size, this is the 21mm size lentil that I will be using today, then you want to establish ahead of time kind of roughly the size of the footprint that you're going to create. I've used this press many times, so I know that roughly I need to make it about 1 inch wide. So now I'm just going to slightly marver this. And even though I've done this many times, I like to always double check to make sure that the bead that I have, or the footprint that I have put together, is actually going to fit within the press. Just doing a little touch up there, grabbing the base of my press, and I'm just going to very carefully lay it on top. You want to make sure that you don't knock off any of the bead release while doing this, and so far so good. If your base bead is too long for the press, it's actually better to just start over with a brand new mandrel. So now I want to create a bicone, so I'm going to be doing that by gathering a large amount of glass at the end of my rod and then applying it right to the center. You can do this by swiping small amounts of glass onto the base bead if you like, but I just find this technique a little bit faster, so that's my preference. Just gathering a lot of glass, and I'm working with all the ports open for a nice wide flame on my torch. I'm using a Carlisle Hellcat, and it will take a little longer if you're on a cooler or smaller torch. I find that with the Hellcat things move fairly quickly. So I'm just winding on a fair bit of glass right into the center and slowly melting it in. I don't want all of the glass to move towards the center. I want to try to keep the base about the same width as it was initially. So I will be using my handheld marver to touch it up a little bit just to make sure that it doesn't shrink too much. The heat will draw the glass towards the center of the bead and you'll lose your bead ends. They'll start to just move too close to the center and you'll have to add more glass. So I like to just shape the bicone a little bit as I go. Just giving it a little touch up. And the handheld marver works great for this. If you have a torch mounted marver, you can use that as well. Double checking, looks like I'm still going to need a little bit of glass. I like to check the mass of the glass that I have against the press this way, rather than doing a test press. The more times you press your bead, the higher the risk you have of actually breaking the bead release inside the bead. And we really want to avoid that. So if you just lay it gently on top of the base of the press, that gives you a pretty good idea of how much glass you're going to need. In this case, I needed to add a little bit more to make sure that I've got enough volume. So going back with my handheld marver, I'm going to touch it up a little bit, working on the ends of the bead and just very gently keeping it in the bicone shape. I find that whenever I'm using a lentil press, starting off with a bicone gives me the best shape in the end. If you do a round bead, it won't work as well. You want to have the ends tapered. So now I'm ready to press. I want to get that nice and hot, lay it on there, come in with the top of the press and press gently but firmly, and there we go. I don't think I put enough glass on there. So if you like this shape, you're welcome to keep it, but I really want to try to get a round shape for my daisy. So let's add a little more volume. Adding some more glass. And in this case, I'm just going to do a couple of coils around the bead ends. Keeping it nice and hot, but also trying to make sure that I don't overheat it. If I do, it will go round, and I've already got it fairly flat, so that's a good thing to try to preserve if possible. Again, coming in with a handheld marver, just touching it up ever so gently. Every time you press the bead, whether it's with your marver or with the press itself, really want to be gentle, because the more times you do this, then the more stress you are going to place on your bead release. I am still keeping this as a bicone shape, so even though it's flattened, I still want to keep those ends slightly tapered. Let's try it again. One more little press. That's looking a lot better. So I will say it's not totally perfect, but rather than just keep fussing and fussing with it, I'm going to move forward and continue on with the daisy. With more practice, this will get easier as you go, so I recommend making a lot of these beads because it'll just get better and better every time. So I've got a little bit of glass that squeaked out the end of the press, so I just touched that up a little bit with my razor tool. And you will notice that I didn't have my mandrel lined up perfectly in the press, so it did scrape off a bit of the bead release on the right-hand side. I'm not too concerned about it though, because it's not inside the bead, so we're just going to leave it and move forward. So I'm starting off now with creating some dots to start off the daisy petals. Now this is a pre-pulled effetre white stringer, but I want it to actually be even smaller than the pre-pulled stringer, so I've pulled a stringer off the end of the stringer. Yeah, you can pre-pull a bunch of very small ones if you prefer, but this works well for me. Starting off using the mandrel as my sight line, I'm creating little dots in a square pattern, top and bottom and side to side, evenly spaced apart. I also want to make sure that the dots are roughly about the same size. So just adding a little glass there. And you'll notice that I flip the bead around a lot because I want to make sure that I continue to heat the back of the bead. It's very easy to get caught up in your surface decoration on the one side and forget to heat the back, and that's when disaster strikes and you're going to lose your bead. So let's make sure that you are constantly turning your bead in the flame. So I pulled a little section again as I used it up. I just pull a little more. The advantage of also doing a stringer on a stringer like this, the advantage is that you actually have a thicker stringer to hold on to, and you're not fussing with a very fine stringer that could break easily. So you get more stability to this way. You can also use a full-size rod and pull a stringer off the end of that as well if you prefer. I'm almost done with the dots. I just have one more set to go in the spaces that are left. So I will need another section of stringer that's a little bit thinner than the pre-pulled stringer, so I'll heat a little gather. And I just use the end of my rod. There's no need to put your bead down and use tweezers. Just use the end of your rod and then very slowly pull. The more slowly you pull your stringer, the thicker it will be. If you pull it quickly, then your stringer might be a little too fine. If you find that you've got excess glass stuck to the end of your mandrel from pulling your little stringers, you want to make sure to just knock that off the way I just did. That way it won't pop off on its own and then accidentally stick to your bead. I'm just very carefully adding the dots in the little spaces that are left. And I want to make sure that the dots actually are not touching one another. It's very important, and very important to monitor your heat as well as you slowly melt these dots in. That way you'll keep those spaces in between so that they look like individual petals. Now I'm just going to move the bead around in the flame very carefully. It's like a little dance, just touching a little bit of one side and then the other. And also it's important to remember to heat the back of your bead while you're also focusing on melting those dots in. If you melt them too quickly, they will merge together and you're going to have some very interesting looking petals. So if you go slowly, then they will melt in and you'll get those nice black spaces in between each dot. I want to make sure that I'm very careful not to melt these dots completely flush into the bead. I want to keep them ever so slightly raised. I will be using the bent steel rake in order to pull those dots towards the center to create the petals. And if they are melted flat into the bead, it's very hard to do the pull evenly without all the dots distorting. So in order to ensure that the dots stay a little bit above the bead, I come in with just the edge of my handheld marver and very gently marver each dot. Again, you want to use light pressure so that you're not having the dots totally melt flat into the bead. Just a little bit at a time, one dot after the other. Don't forget to heat the back of your bead as well. Just about done. Each one is getting a little bit of a marver, and I'm just making sure that they're not overly pressed. And I've still maintained those black spaces in between. So in order to make sure that I pull those dots evenly towards the middle, I'm going to create a little divot right in the very center of the bead. And that's going to be my sight line. So when I'm pulling each dot, that's the point I'm going to pull them to. And that way all the petals should be relatively even. Now I'm going to be using my bent steel rake and focusing the heat on one of the dots. I want to grab the glass from the center of the dot and pull towards the little divot in the middle of the bead. In order to do this effectively, you actually need to have your rake in the flame. If you take your bead out of the flame, it will cool so quickly that you won't actually be able to pull it at all with the rake. One of the phrases that I use for all my students is it's got to glow to go. So if the glass isn't glowing, it won't go anywhere. I hope that makes sense. So heating one dot and then another, going on opposite sides of the bead. I focus the heat on the dot, keeping the rake in the flame, and then pulling towards the center. So don't worry, this actually will not damage your tool. And the reason why is because you're going to have a little glass of water to the right side if you're right-handed, or to the left if you're left-handed. And in between each application of the rake to the bead, you're going to dunk it in some cool water. And that will preserve the life of your tool and make this whole process work so much better. And if you need to, you can do more than one pull just to adjust them slightly as well. I'm not worried about the petals looking absolutely perfect. Nothing in nature is perfect, and that's what makes it perfect. So again, just heating those dots, touching them up if need be, pulling them towards the center, and making sure that I cool the rake in between. Heat and pull, heat and pull. If you need a little bit of more definition in between two of the dots, or if two of your dots melt together, you can actually rake the black area in between, and it will divide those dots, or divide one big dot into two very effectively. So you can do that as well to correct any overzealous dots that have melted together. Now I'm getting a lot closer to where I want to be here. And you'll see that when I take the rake and I take it and put it in the water, I automatically flip the bead to the back. And this is a movement that I have done for years, and I don't even think about it. It's completely subconscious at this point. But when the rake moves away, the bead flips over. And if you kind of just practice this over and over, you will find that it will really protect your bead from cracking in the back. And you won't even have to really think about it anymore. So I just find that really helpful. Now, I use my bent steel rake for nearly every bead, so I do this all the time. So now I've got the petals pulled toward the center. I'm heating the center, and I'm just using the clean end of a 332-inch mandrel to push that center blob of glass deeper into the bead. I like to do this rather than try to marver it flat, because if you use a marver, you're going to distort the shape of those petals. If you just push them in with a mandrel or another poker tool, a brass tool as well would work great, then you're going to keep the dots nicely pointed towards the center. It's not going to distort them. And I'm just touching up any little areas that look a little messy and tucking those ends into the center of the bead. And we're getting close to the end. The color I'm using for the center is ochre yellow. I've got a little bit of a short stringer pulled at the end because I don't need to use the whole rod. Heating the back and just making a little small gather and applying that to the center. And there you go. Doesn't take very much. And you can use another color if you prefer. You could have a lot of fun making these flowers in multiple colors. Change the petal color, change the background color, change the center color. Do alternating colors on the petals. Do rainbow petals. You could do all sorts of colors, techniques, and styles. Just have fun with it. So here we go. I'm just heating the back, making sure that that dot is nicely marvered in so it's nice and smooth. And here we have a really sweet little daisy bead. I hope you really enjoyed this tutorial and that you'll tune in next time and learn something new. Happy torching!